Officer McClane, a racist cop, throws a black teen named Malik out of his car, treating him unfairly. But 15 minutes later, Malik's cold revenge hits hard, exposing everything Officer McClane has done. What unexpected consequences will McClane face for his actions? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Malik James carefully arranged the last box of cereal on the shelf, making sure the bright packaging faced forward just right. The fluorescent lights of Morton's grocery store hummed softly overhead as he stepped back to inspect his work. Even after a long 8-hour shift, he took pride in doing things properly. "Looking good as always, Malik," Mr. Morton called out from the end of the aisle. The store owner's weathered face broke into a warm smile. "You're the only one who stocks these shelves exactly the way I like them." "Thank you, sir," Malik replied, his quiet voice carrying the respect his grandmother had taught him to show to his elders. "Just trying to do my best." "And that's why you're my star employee." Mr. Morton checked his watch. "It's almost night. Why don't you head on home? Your grandmother will be waiting." Malik nodded gratefully. After collecting his things from the break room, he counted his tips from bagging groceries. $12, not bad for a Thursday night. Every little bit helped toward his college fund. The cool evening air felt refreshing on his face as he walked the familiar route home. His mind wandered to the acceptance letter from State University sitting on his desk at home. The scholarship would cover most of his tuition, but there were still books and living expenses to think about. That's why he picked up extra shifts whenever he could. The porch light was on at his grandmother's modest 2-bedroom house, casting a warm glow that always made him feel welcome. The sweet smell of her famous peach cobbler drifted through the screen door. "That you, baby?" his grandmother called out as he stepped inside. "Yes, ma'am," Malik answered, following the delicious aroma to the kitchen. His grandmother stood at the counter, her silver hair tied back neatly in her usual bun. "How was work?" she asked, pulling him in for a quick hug. Even at 18, Malik didn't mind his grandmother's affection. After losing his mother 2 years ago, these simple moments meant everything to him. "It was good. Mr. Morton says hi." Malik grabbed plates from the cabinet without being asked. It was their routine. She cooked, he set the table. "The cobbler smells amazing, Gran." "Well, I know it's your favorite." She patted his cheek softly. "Just like it was your mama's." Malik felt the familiar ache in his chest at the mention of his mother, but it was a gentle pain now, wrapped in warm memories. Her photo smiled down at them from the wall, the same kind eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. "She'd be so proud of you," his grandmother said quietly, reading his thoughts the way she always could. "Working so hard, keeping your grades up, never giving me a moment's worry. You're going to do great things, Malik James." Malik helped his grandmother to her chair before sitting down himself. As they said grace together, he felt blessed despite everything life had thrown at him. He had a job he was good at, a grandmother who loved him, and dreams worth working for. For now, that was more than enough. The next afternoon, Malik's shift ended just as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in warm orange hues. He waved goodbye to Mr. Morton and climbed into his late mother's old Honda Civic, the car she'd left him, still running well despite its age. The familiar route home took him down Palmer Road, a quiet stretch that wound through the outskirts of town. Blue and red lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. Malik's heart skipped a beat, but he remained calm, remembering his mother's careful instructions about police encounters. He pulled over smoothly, turned off the engine, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. Officer McClane approached with heavy footsteps, his flashlight beam cutting through Malik's side window despite the remaining daylight. "License and registration," he barked, without introducing himself or stating the reason for the stop. "Yes, sir," Malik replied politely, reaching slowly for his wallet. "May I ask what I did wrong?" McClane's face hardened. "You rolled through that stop sign back there. Don't play dumb with me, boy." Malik knew he'd made a complete stop, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm sorry if it appeared that way, sir. I always try to be careful." "Step out of the vehicle," McLean ordered, his hand resting on his belt. The situation was escalating too quickly. Malik's hands trembled slightly as he unbuckled his seatbelt. The evening air felt suddenly cold as he stood beside his car. "Spread your legs, hands on the hood." McLean's commands came sharp and loud. "Sir, I don't understand." "I said hands on the hood." Malik complied, his cheeks burning with humiliation as passing cars slowed to stare. Officer McLean patted him down roughly, then made him stand there while he searched the car without permission. "Nothing here," McLean muttered, sounding almost disappointed. He walked back to Malik, who still hadn't been allowed to move from the hood. "I'm going to let you off with a warning this time, but I need to report and have this car checked, but I've got my eye on you." "May I have my keys back, sir?" Malik asked, noticing them still in McLean's hand. The officer smirked, then the keys on his pocket not giving to Malik. Malik watched McLean's patrol car disappear around the bend, his heart pounding. The sun had nearly set now, and this stretch of road was getting darker by the minute. Mrs. Helen Harris was driving home from her weekly bridge club when she spotted a familiar figure walking slowly along Palmer Road. The streetlights had just flickered on, illuminating Malik's dejected posture. She pulled her well-maintained Buick to the curb. "Malik James, what on earth are you doing out here at this hour?" she called through her passenger window. Malik's shoulders straightened at the sound of her voice. "Mrs. Helen, His voice cracked slightly. She could see the distress on his face even in the dim light. "Get in this car right now and tell me what's wrong." Once inside, Malik shared what had happened with Officer McLean. Mrs. Harris's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she listened, her expression growing stormier with each detail. "Oh no," she said firmly, making a sharp U-turn. "This stops right here, right now." "Mrs. Helen, you don't have to—" "Hush now," she cut him off gently. "Your mother was like a daughter to me, and I promised her I'd look after you. We're going to the police station." 10 minutes later, Mrs. Harris marched through the station doors with Malik beside her. Her presence commanded immediate attention. Everyone knew Mrs. Helen Harris, who'd taught half the town's children during her 40 years as a teacher. "I need to see Captain Reynolds," she announced to the desk sergeant. "And I need to see him now." Her tone brooked no argument. Soon they were seated in the captain's office, where Mrs. Harris laid out the evening's events in precise, measured words. Her voice carried through the open door, drawing other officers to listen. "This officer humiliated a young man who's never been in trouble a day in his life," she declared, her voice steady but filled with controlled anger. "He threw his keys into the grass and left him stranded on a dark road. Now I want to know what you're going to do about it." The captain began to offer platitudes, but Mrs. Harris wasn't finished. "Let me be very clear," she continued, rising to her full height. "I've lived in this town for 68 years. I know every council member, every newspaper editor, and every civil rights lawyer in 3 counties. If this isn't investigated properly, I will hold this entire department accountable." By now, several people had gathered in the hallway, including some civilians waiting to file reports. Phones were out, and Mrs. Harris's words were already spreading through text messages and social media. "I want Officer McLean's body camera footage reviewed immediately," she insisted, "and I want a formal investigation opened tonight." The captain, aware of the growing crowd and Mrs. Harris's influence in the community, nodded slowly. "Of course, Mrs. Harris. We'll begin right away." The next morning, Mrs. Harris sat at her kitchen table with her old-fashioned address book open and her telephone at the ready. She'd already made 8 calls before finishing her first cup of coffee, and she showed no signs of slowing down. "Martha, you won't believe what happened to young Malik James last night," she said into the receiver, her voice carrying the weight of urgency. "Yes, Margaret's grandson. That sweet boy who helps with the church fundraisers." As she detailed the previous night's events, her fingers traced down her list of names. Each call ended the same way. "The town hall meeting is next Tuesday at 7. We need everyone there to show support. This isn't just about Malik. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else's child." Across town, Malik sat at his grandmother's kitchen table, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. His grandmother, Rose, watched him with concerned eyes as she sipped her tea. "Baby, you don't have to do this if you're not ready," she said softly, reaching across to touch his hand. Malik looked up at her, seeing the worry etched in her familiar features. "I keep thinking about what Mom would do," he said quietly. His grandmother's eyes grew misty. "Your mother never backed down from what was right, even when it was hard." She squeezed his hand. "But she also never wanted you to carry burdens alone." "I thought about just letting it go," Malik admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But then I remembered what Mom always said about standing up for what's right. And Mrs. Helen—" He paused, a small smile touching his lips. "She's like a force of nature." His grandmother chuckled. "That she is. Already called me twice this morning." Malik's phone buzzed with another message. It was from his coworker, Jerome. "Man, my mom just told me what happened. The whole neighborhood's talking about it. We've got your back." As Malik read more messages of support, something shifted inside him. His shoulders straightened, and the knot of anxiety in his stomach began to loosen. This wasn't just about one bad night anymore. It wasn't even just about him. "You know what, Grandma?" he said, his voice stronger now. "Mrs. Helen's right. If nobody speaks up, nothing changes. Maybe this is bigger than just me." His grandmother's eyes shone with pride. "Your mother would be so proud of you right now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And so am I." Meanwhile, Mrs. Harris's phone campaign continued. By mid-morning, she had reached out to the pastor's wife, 3 retired teachers, the owner of the local diner, and countless others. Each call added another ripple to the growing wave of community support, building momentum for the upcoming town hall meeting. The news of Malik's encounter with Officer McLean spread through the community like wildfire. At the local diner, heated discussions broke out over coffee and pancakes. Some customers slammed their fists on tables, outraged by the officer's behavior, while others spoke in hushed, worried tones. "That Malik's such a good kid," said Mr. Thompson, the hardware store owner, shaking his head. "Always holds the door for folks, helps his grandmother with her groceries. No way he did anything wrong." But not everyone shared his certainty. At the grocery store where Malik worked, a small group of regular customers huddled near the produce section, whispering their doubts. "Maybe there's more to the story," one woman murmured. "These things are never simple." Another added, "Speaking up might just make things worse for everyone." Mrs. Harris, however, refused to let such doubts go unchallenged. When she overheard similar conversations at the pharmacy, she stepped right in, her voice firm but kind. "I've known Malik James since he was knee-high to a grasshopper," she declared. "That boy has more integrity in his little finger than most folks have in their whole body. And I was there at the police station. I saw how they reacted when I told them what happened." Later that afternoon, she visited Malik at his grandmother's house. Finding him in the backyard, she noticed the slight slump in his shoulders as he read comments on his phone. "Some people don't believe me," he said quietly. Mrs. Harris settled into the porch chair beside him. "Let me tell you something, Malik. When people face uncomfortable truths, some of them look away, but that doesn't make those truths any less real." She reached over and patted his hand. "Your mother knew that. She taught you to stand tall, didn't she?" Malik nodded, sitting up straighter. "Standing up to injustice isn't about being liked by everyone," Mrs. Harris continued, her voice warm but firm. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "But what if nothing changes?" Malik asked. Mrs. Harris's eyes sparkled with determination. "Change happens one brave person at a time. You're not just standing up for yourself. You're standing up for every person who's ever been treated unfairly, but stayed quiet out of fear." As they talked, Malik felt his confidence growing stronger. Mrs. Harris's unwavering support and fierce advocacy reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. The doubters' whispers seemed less important now, drowned out by the voices of those who stood beside him. Malik sat alone in his bedroom, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the window. His mother's framed photo stood on his nightstand, her warm smile seeming to shine directly at him. He picked up the frame, running his thumb gently across the glass. "You always knew what to say, Mom," he whispered. Memories flooded back, moments when his mother had shaped his character through both words and actions. He remembered being 10 years old, watching her help Mrs. Peterson next door after the elderly woman had said unkind things about their family at a neighborhood meeting. "But why are you being nice to her?" young Malik had asked, confused. His mother had knelt down, looking him straight in the eyes. "Because kindness isn't about what others deserve, baby. It's about who we choose to be." Now, 7 years later, her words rang clearer than ever. Malik placed the photo back on his nightstand and walked to his window, watching the trees sway in the breeze. His mother had taught him that standing up for what's right didn't mean letting go of your dignity or compassion. He remembered another lesson from when he was 13. A boy at school had been bullying him, and Malik had wanted to fight back with harsh words and anger. His mother had sat with him on their front porch swing. "Fighting hatred with hatred is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline," she'd explained, her voice gentle but firm. "You can stand strong without becoming what you're fighting against." Malik took a deep breath, letting these memories wash over him. The town hall meeting was just hours away, and his heart was racing. But his mother's teachings anchored him, reminding him that true strength came from maintaining your principles even in the face of injustice. He thought about Officer McLean's angry face, his harsh words, the humiliation of being left on that dark road. But instead of letting anger consume him, Malik focused on what his mother would want him to do: speak his truth with dignity, stand firm with grace, and fight for justice without losing his humanity. "I won't let you down, Mom," he whispered, touching the frame one last time. His voice grew stronger as he added, "I'll handle this the way you taught me, with truth and fairness." In that quiet moment, Malik felt his resolve solidify. His mother's lessons weren't just memories, they were a roadmap for facing this challenge. He would confront McLean's actions not with vengeance, but with the unwavering pursuit of justice and truth she had instilled in him. In the living room of Malik's grandmother's house, a small group gathered around the coffee table. His grandmother sat in her favorite armchair, while Mrs. Harris perched on the sofa beside him. Several of Malik's friends from school and work had come too, forming a supportive circle. "Just speak from your heart, baby," his grandmother said, reaching over to pat his hand. Her eyes were bright with pride, though worry lines creased her forehead. Malik looked down at the notepad in front of him where he'd been jotting down points for his speech. The paper was covered in crossed-out lines and arrows, showing his struggle to find the right words. Mrs. Harris leaned forward, her voice steady and encouraging. "Tell them exactly what happened, Malik. No need to dress it up or down. The truth has power all on its own." "What if people don't believe me?" Malik's voice was quiet, but the room fell silent at his words. "They'll believe you," said Marcus, his friend from the grocery store. "You're the most honest person I know. Everyone who knows you knows that." Sarah, his classmate from AP History, nodded firmly. "Plus, you've got half the town behind you already." Mrs. Harris made sure of that. The group spent the next hour helping Malik organize his thoughts. They listened as he practiced speaking, offering gentle suggestions and supportive nods. His grandmother brought out cookies and lemonade, just like she used to do when he studied for big tests. As they worked, Malik felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about his own experience anymore. He thought about other kids who might have gone through similar situations, but stayed quiet out of fear or shame. "You know what?" he said, straightening his shoulders. "Maybe this is bigger than just what happened to me." His grandmother's eyes welled with tears. "That's exactly what your mother would say." Mrs. Harris reached for Malik's notepad. "Let's make sure we mention that. This isn't about attacking anyone. It's about making sure everyone in our community feels safe and respected." The afternoon light began to fade as they continued working. Malik's nervousness didn't disappear, but it transformed into something different, a mix of determination and hope. With each practice run-through, his voice grew stronger, his words more certain. "You're ready," Mrs. Harris finally declared, and the others nodded in agreement. Malik looked around at the faces of his supporters, his grandmother's gentle smile, Mrs. Harris's determined expression, his friends' encouraging grins. In that moment, He understood that while he would be the one speaking at the town hall meeting, he wouldn't be standing alone. The town hall was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Malik approached the podium, his heart pounding. The council members sat behind their long table, their faces a mix of polite attention and guarded expressions. Taking a deep breath, Malik gripped the edges of the podium. He spotted his grandmother and Mrs. Harris in the front row, both nodding encouragingly. Their presence gave him strength. "Good evening," he began, his voice shaky at first but growing steadier with each word. "My name is Malik James. 3 days ago, I was driving home from my job at Walker's Grocery when Officer McLean pulled me over." As Malik described the traffic stop, the humiliation in being left stranded on that dark road, a heavy silence fell over the room. He didn't raise his voice or use angry words. He just told the truth, exactly as it happened. "I've lived in this town my whole life," Malik continued. "My mother taught me to treat everyone with respect no matter what. That night I was respectful. I followed every instruction, but it didn't matter." Several heads nodded in the crowd while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Councilwoman Peters leaned forward, her brow furrowed with concern. But Councilman Rodriguez sat back with his arms crossed, skepticism clear on his face. "This isn't just about me," Malik said, his voice growing stronger. "It's about making sure nobody else has to feel the way I felt that night, scared, alone, and treated like I didn't matter. We need accountability to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people were nodding vigorously, while others whispered to their neighbors with doubtful expressions. Near the back, Malik noticed Officer McLean himself, standing with a group of other officers, his face hard and dismissive. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Malik said, looking directly at the council members. "I'm here because I believe in our community. I believe we can do better. And I'm asking you to help make that happen." His grandmother wiped tears from her eyes as Mrs. Harris squeezed her hand. Several community members were dabbing at their eyes too, moved by Malik's sincere words. But the room remained divided. While many faces showed support and understanding, others displayed doubt or resistance. Council President Thompson's expression was unreadable as he made notes on his legal pad. The police chief sat stone-faced, occasionally whispering to his deputy. As Malik finished speaking, the tension in the room was palpable. The applause that followed was scattered at first, then grew stronger as Mrs. Harris stood up, followed by others in the crowd. Yet pockets of silence remained, highlighting the challenge that lay ahead. After the town hall meeting, Malik and Mrs. Harris sat at her kitchen table, steam rising from their cups of chamomile tea. The evening light filtered through her lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across the worn tablecloth. "You did well tonight, Malik," Mrs. Harris said, stirring honey into her tea. "But I think we need more voices to join yours. I know for a fact that Officer McLean has done this to others." Malik wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "You really think others will speak up?" "Sometimes people just need to know they're not alone." Mrs. Harris reached for her phone. "I'm going to make some calls. Start with people I trust." The next afternoon, Malik found himself on the porch of Mrs. Beverly Turner, his mother's closest friend. The familiar scent of her rose garden brought back memories of afternoon visits with his mom. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Mrs. Turner said, settling into her favorite rocking chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "What happened to you? It happened to me too, last year." Malik leaned forward, listening intently as Mrs. Turner described her encounter with McLean. She'd been driving home from church when he pulled her over, accused her of suspicious behavior, and searched her car without cause. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to report him, but who would believe me? I thought I was alone." Tears welled in her eyes. "When I heard you speak up at the town hall, I felt ashamed for staying quiet. Your courage, it reminds me so much of your mother." "Please don't feel ashamed, Mrs. Turner," Malik said gently, "but it's not too late to share your story." Mrs. Turner nodded, straightening her shoulders. You're right. I'll speak up now. For you, for your mother, for everyone who's been afraid. As they talked, Mrs. Harris's phone calls were already bearing fruit. 3 other community members had agreed to come forward with their stories about McLean. Each account revealed a similar pattern: unnecessary stops, intimidation, abuse of power. The growing collection of testimonies strengthened Malik's resolve. This wasn't just about one incident on a dark road anymore. It was about years of unchecked behavior, about fear keeping people silent, about the need for change. Meanwhile, inside the police station, Captain Reynolds paced behind his desk, his face flushed with anger. Officer McLean stood at attention, but his usual arrogant demeanor showed cracks as the captain's voice filled the small office. Do you understand what you've done, McLean? Captain Reynolds stopped pacing and planted both hands on his desk. I've got dozens of calls coming in. The mayor's office is breathing down my neck, and now we've got multiple people coming forward with similar stories about you. McLean shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. Sir, I was just doing my job. The boy, Captain Reynolds cut in sharply, is a model citizen with a spotless record. His boss called me personally to vouch for his character. And Mrs. Harris? She's one of the most respected voices in this community. The captain picked up a stack of papers from his desk. And now I'm looking at complaint after complaint, stories that were never properly filed because people were too afraid to come forward, leaving a teenager stranded on a dark road. What were you thinking? McLean's face reddened. I followed protocol. Protocol? Captain Reynolds' voice rose. Show me where in the protocol it says to abuse your authority. Show me where it says to harass law-abiding citizens. Through the office window, they could see other officers gathering, trying to appear busy while obviously listening to the confrontation. The community's trust in this department is crumbling because of your actions, Captain Reynolds continued. They're calling for a complete review of our procedures, our training, everything. And you know what? They're right to demand it. McLean's facade finally cracked. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation, Captain Reynolds said firmly. Turn in your badge and gun. And McLean? He leaned forward, his voice low but intense. You better pray we can rebuild the community's trust, because your actions have endangered everything we're supposed to stand for. In the warm glow of the church's fellowship hall, Malik helped Mrs. Harris arrange chairs in a circle. His hands trembled slightly as he placed each seat, knowing the importance of what they were about to do. Remember, dear, Mrs. Harris said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You've given these people hope. Sometimes that's all someone needs to find their voice. The room slowly filled with community members, their faces a mix of determination and nervousness. Malik recognized some from the town hall meeting, but others were new faces. They settled into their chairs quietly, exchanging understanding glances. Mrs. Harris stood at the center of the circle. Thank you all for coming tonight, she began, her voice warm and reassuring. This is a safe space. We're here to listen and support each other. An elderly man raised his hand first. His voice quivered as he described how McLean had harassed his grandson last summer, threatening him with arrest for simply sitting on his own front porch. A middle-aged woman shared how McLean had pulled her over 3 times in 1 month, each time making snide remarks about her accent. As each person spoke, Malik felt a deep ache in his chest. Their stories echoed his own experience, the fear, the humiliation, the helplessness. But there was something else too. He saw strength in their eyes, courage in their voices. I never thought I could speak up, a young woman admitted, wiping tears from her eyes. But when I heard about what you did, Malik, how you stood up at that town hall, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Others nodded in agreement. One by one, they shared similar sentiments, how Malik's bravery had inspired them, given them hope that maybe things could change. Mrs. Harris watched Malik's face carefully as he absorbed each story. She could see the realization dawning in his eyes, the understanding that his single act of courage had created ripples throughout the community. I just wanted to do what was right, Malik said quietly when the stories finished. I didn't know. I didn't realize how many others. That's exactly why we needed someone like you, Mrs. Harris responded, her voice filled with pride. Sometimes it just takes one person to stand up first. Look around this room. Every person here is stronger because you showed them it was possible to speak up. Malik looked at the faces around him. No longer strangers, but allies united by shared experiences and a common hope for change. His mother's words echoed in his mind about treating others fairly, and he understood now that standing up for justice wasn't just about himself. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless against unfairness. The morning after the community meeting, Malik sat at his grandmother's kitchen table, staring at the front page of the local newspaper. His hands shook slightly as he read the headline, "Local Teen Challenges Police Conduct, Community Divided." The article detailed his speech at the town hall and included quotes from various community members. Some praised his courage, calling him a role model for standing up against injustice. Others questioned his motives, suggesting he might be exaggerating or seeking attention. "Don't let those doubters get to you," his grandmother said, placing a warm cup of tea in front of him. Her voice was gentle, but firm. "We know the truth." Throughout the day, Malik's phone buzzed constantly with messages and calls. Former classmates reached out to share support, while others sent hurtful comments questioning his character. At the grocery store where he worked, some customers went out of their way to pat him on the back, while others avoided his checkout line entirely. "My boy," his boss pulled him aside during his shift, "what you're doing takes guts. Don't let anyone tell you different." At home that evening, Malik's grandmother sat in her favorite armchair, clutching the newspaper. Her hands trembled as she read some of the nastier comments in the letters section. "Maybe we should have kept this quieter," she worried aloud. "Grandma," Malik said, kneeling beside her chair, "Mom always taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Tears welled in his grandmother's eyes as she cupped his face in her weathered hands. "Your mother would be so proud of you, I know I am." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "I just worry about you, that's all." Mrs. Harris called later that evening, her voice full of determination. "The newspaper coverage is exactly what we needed, Malik. Yes, there are some negative responses, but look how many people are finally talking about this issue. That's how change begins." Malik sat on his bed that night, reading through the article again. The weight of being in the public eye felt heavy on his shoulders, but when he thought about the people at the church meeting, their stories, their trust in him, he knew he couldn't back down now. His phone lit up with another message, this one from a stranger thanking him for giving them courage to speak up about their own experience with Officer McLean. The mixture of support and criticism swirled around him like a storm, but at his core, Malik felt a steady certainty. His grandmother's pride, his mother's teachings, and the community's growing voice gave him strength. Even as some people tried to discredit him, he remembered the faces in that church circle and knew that speaking up had been the right choice. Captain Reynolds sat behind his polished desk, his expression serious as he faced Malik and Mrs. Harris. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, casting strips of light across the office's worn carpet. "We take these allegations very seriously," Captain Reynolds said, folding his hands on his desk. "Given the number of community members who have come forward, we're launching a full internal investigation into Officer McLean's conduct." Malik sat straight in his chair, his heart pounding. Mrs. Harris placed a steady hand on his arm, her presence giving him strength. "What exactly will this investigation involve?" Mrs. Harris asked, her voice calm but firm. "We'll be reviewing all complaints filed against Officer McLean, examining body camera footage, and interviewing witnesses," Captain Reynolds explained. "We'll also be looking into the specific incident with Malik in detail." Malik cleared his throat. "Will Officer McLean still be on duty during the investigation?" The captain shook his head. "He's been placed on administrative leave pending the results of our inquiry. This is standard procedure." Mrs. Harris nodded approvingly. "And how long will this investigation take?" "We aim to be thorough rather than rushed," Captain Reynolds replied. "But I assure you, we won't let this drag on unnecessarily. We understand the community's concerns." For the first time since the incident, Malik felt a small spark of hope. The captain's words seemed genuine, and the fact that McLean had been placed on leave showed they were taking the situation seriously. "We'll need you to provide a detailed written statement," Captain Reynolds continued, sliding a form across his desk. "And we may need to interview you again as the investigation progresses." "Malik won't be alone in any future interviews," Mrs. Harris stated firmly. It wasn't a question. "Of course," the captain agreed. "You're welcome to have representation present during any questioning." As they left the police station, several officers nodded respectfully in their direction. The atmosphere felt different from the night Mrs. Harris had first brought Malik in, less hostile, more attentive. "Well?" Mrs. Harris asked as they walked down the station steps. Malik took a deep breath of the morning air. I think they might actually do something this time." Mrs. Harris squeezed his shoulder. "They better. And we'll be watching every step of the way to make sure they do." The whispers and stares followed Malik everywhere he went. At the grocery store where he worked, some regular customers who'd always been friendly now avoided his aisle or gave him cold looks. A few even made snide comments just loud enough for him to hear. "Trying to ruin a good officer's career," muttered one elderly man as he passed by with his cart. "Should be grateful he just got a warning," said another customer to her friend. Each comment stung, but Malik kept his head high and continued bagging groceries with the same care and attention he always had. His boss, Mr. Peterson, noticed the tension and made a point of checking on him more frequently. At home, things weren't much easier. His grandmother found nasty notes in their mailbox, and someone had called their house 3 times just to hang up. She tried to hide her worry, but Malik could see the strain in the new wrinkles around her eyes, and the way she kept peeking through the curtains. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Malik's grandmother sat at their small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "Maybe we should let this go," she said softly. "I hate seeing what it's doing to you, baby." Malik pulled up a chair next to her and gently took one of her hands in his. "Grandma, remember what Mom always used to say about doing what's right?" His grandmother's eyes grew misty. "That it's not always the easy choice, but it's the only choice that lets you sleep at night." "These people supporting McLean," Malik said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his chest. "They're scared of change, but that doesn't make what happened right, and it doesn't mean we should back down. But the phone calls, the notes, are nothing compared to what could happen if we let McLean keep treating people this way," Malik finished. "What if the next person he stops is someone who can't speak up? What if they don't have someone like Mrs. Harris in their corner?" His grandmother squeezed his hand, pride mixing with concern on her face. "When did you get so wise?" "I had good teachers," Malik replied with a small smile. "You and Mom taught me that standing up for what's right is worth any personal discomfort. And that's what we're doing. Standing up for what's right." Tears slipped down his grandmother's cheeks as she pulled him into a tight hug. "Your mama would be so proud of you right now. So proud." Malik held his grandmother close, drawing strength from her embrace just as she drew strength from his conviction. The road ahead might be rough, but they would walk it together, knowing that their cause was just. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filed into the large meeting room. Mrs. Harris sat in the front row, her back straight and her eyes fixed on Malik, who stood quietly at the podium. She had helped him prepare his speech, but now it was his moment to shine. Malik's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. The room fell silent, and he could feel dozens of eyes watching him. Some faces showed support, others skepticism, but all were waiting to hear what this young man had to say. "Good evening," Malik began, his voice soft but clear. "I'm here tonight not just because of what happened to me, but because of what could happen to anyone in our community if we don't speak up." Mrs. Harris nodded encouragingly, and Malik's confidence grew. "Officer McLean didn't just disrespect me that night," he continued. "He disrespected everything our community stands for. We're neighbors here. We're friends. We shop at the same stores. Our kids go to the same schools. When we see each other on the street, we wave and smile." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Malik's words seemed to touch something deep within the audience. "My mother taught me that respect goes both ways," he said, his voice growing stronger. "She taught me that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are or what uniform they wear. And that's what I'm asking for today, not just for myself, but for all of us." Mrs. Harris watched as heads nodded throughout the room. Even some who had seemed skeptical were listening intently now. "We don't have to be divided on this," Malik said, his earnest tone reaching every corner of the room. "We can work together to make sure everyone feels safe and respected in our community. That's not just my dream. I believe it's all of ours." As Malik spoke, Mrs. Harris noticed people leaning forward in their seats, completely engaged. She saw tears in some eyes and determined nods from others. This was exactly what she had hoped for when she encouraged Malik to speak. His sincerity was undeniable, his message impossible to ignore. "Change starts with each of us," Malik concluded, his voice full of quiet conviction. "And it starts by standing together, not apart." The room erupted in applause. People stood up, some wiping tears from their eyes, others reaching out to pat Malik's shoulder as he made his way back to his seat. Mrs. Harris beamed with pride, her own eyes glistening. She had known Malik had it in him to move hearts, and tonight he had proved her right. As more community members approached Malik to express their support, Mrs. Harris watched with satisfaction. His words had done more than just tell his story. They had bridged divides and opened hearts. This was exactly the kind of leadership their community needed. Captain Reynolds stood before the gathered press, his voice firm and clear. "The department is committed to a fully transparent investigation into the incident involving Officer McLean and Mr. James. We take these allegations seriously and will examine all available evidence thoroughly." The announcement made headlines in the local paper, putting Officer McLean under intense scrutiny. As pressure mounted, McLean began showing up at local diners and coffee shops, places where he knew his supporters gathered. "You didn't hear the whole story," McLean would say, leaning in close to whoever would listen. "That kid was nothing but disrespectful from the moment I pulled him over. Started mouthing off, making threats. I was just doing my job, trying to keep our streets safe." The whispers spread through the community like wildfire. At the grocery store where Malik worked, some regular customers who had always been friendly now gave him uncertain looks. A few even switched checkout lines to avoid him. Malik's grandmother noticed the change too. She watched from her porch as neighbors who usually waved now hurried past without making eye contact. One afternoon, she found Malik sitting quietly in the kitchen, staring at his phone. "Some people are saying I threatened Officer McLean," Malik said softly, showing her the local community Facebook page. "They're saying I was aggressive, and that's why he had to be tough with me." His grandmother's face tightened with worry. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Those who know you know the truth," she said, though her voice carried a note of concern. At church that Sunday, Malik's family felt the weight of divided opinions. Some congregation members embraced them warmly, while others whispered behind their hands. Mrs. Peterson, who had always brought them casseroles when they were sick, now sat on the opposite side of the sanctuary. "Maybe we should just let this go," Malik's sister suggested one evening, her voice trembling. "These rumors are getting worse. What if it affects your college applications?" Malik's grandmother watched her family's distress grow as McLean's accusations gained traction. Even their closest friends seemed unsure what to believe. The strain showed on their faces during dinner, in the way they checked their phones more frequently and their quieter conversations. The rumors reached Mrs. Harris too. She arrived at their house one afternoon, her face tight with anger. "McLean's trying to paint you as the aggressor," she said, settling into their living room. "He's got people believing you were the one who acted inappropriately that night." Malik's grandmother wrung her hands. "Some folks aren't even looking us in the eye anymore," she admitted. "I'm worried about what this is doing to our family, to Malik's future." Mrs. Harris reached out and took their hands. "That's exactly what McLean wants. For us to back down, to question ourselves. But we can't let fear of these lies stop us from standing up for what's right." The tide began to turn at the weekly farmers market, where Mayor Thompson usually spent his Saturday mornings talking with constituents. As he made his way through the stalls, he overheard several versions of McLean's story being discussed. The mayor's face grew increasingly troubled as he listened. Later that afternoon, Mayor Thompson called an impromptu press conference on the steps of City Hall. Camera crews and reporters gathered quickly, sensing something important was about to happen. "I've known Malik James and his family for years," the mayor began, his voice strong and clear. "His mother was one of our most dedicated elementary school teachers before her passing. Malik himself has shown nothing but respect and integrity in our community. These attempts to damage his character are not only harmful but completely inconsistent with everything we know about this young man." The mayor's words echoed through the local news channels. His unwavering support sent ripples through the community. People who had been hesitant to take sides now began to speak up. At the police department, officers who had previously stayed quiet started distancing themselves from McLean. When he entered the break room, conversations would stop. His usual lunch companions found reasons to eat at their desks. Mrs. Harris organized a community support rally in the park across from the police station. The turnout surprised everyone. Teachers from Malik's school showed up with handmade signs. His co-workers from the grocery store came wearing their work aprons. Even Mr. Chen, the quiet owner of the corner store where Malik bought his grandmother's morning paper, stood proudly among the supporters. "This is what community looks like," Mayor Thompson declared, standing beside Malik and his grandmother. "We stand together against injustice. We support truth over rumors." Malik's grandmother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as she watched more people arrive. Her church group had come in full force, carrying trays of food and drinks for the gathered crowd. The sight of so many familiar faces now standing firmly with them made her shoulders straighten with pride. The local newspaper ran a front-page story featuring interviews with people who knew Malik, his teachers, his boss at the grocery store, elderly neighbors he helped with yard work. Each account painted the same picture: a respectful, hard-working young man who could never have acted the way McLean claimed. At the police station, Captain Reynolds called McLean into his office. The other officers watched through the glass walls as their captain gestured firmly, his expression stern. When McLean emerged, his face was red, and he walked straight to his desk without looking at anyone. That evening, as Malik helped his grandmother prepare dinner, their doorbell kept ringing with visitors bringing food and words of encouragement. The kitchen counter disappeared under casseroles and pies, each dish a testament to the community's support. "See," Mrs. Harris said, arranging another pie on their crowded table. "Truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how hard some people try to sink it." Captain Reynolds sat at his desk, a thick folder open before him. The results of the internal investigation into Officer McLean's conduct filled page after page. His hands trembled slightly as he read through the documented incidents, a pattern that should have been addressed long ago. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple complaints had been filed over the years, each describing similar instances of intimidation and abuse of power. Some had been buried in administrative paperwork, others dismissed without proper review. But now, laid out chronologically, they painted an undeniable picture of systematic misconduct. "This should never have gone on so long," Captain Reynolds muttered, rubbing his temples. He picked up his phone and called for an emergency meeting with the police review board. Within an hour, the conference room filled with serious-faced department officials and city representatives. The captain stood at the head of the table, McLean's file spread out before them. "The evidence speaks for itself," Captain Reynolds announced, his voice heavy with responsibility. "Officer McLean has repeatedly violated department policy and public trust. We have documented instances of racial profiling, excessive force, and abuse of authority spanning the past 5 years." The review board members passed the evidence folders among themselves, their expressions growing grimmer with each page. Photos, witness statements, and official complaints built an irrefutable case against McLean. "In light of these findings," Captain Reynolds continued, "and in response to the community's justified demands for accountability, I am initiating Officer McLean's immediate termination from the force." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, the board members nodded their agreement. The decision was unanimous. Later that afternoon, McLean was called into the captain's office. His face turned ashen as Captain Reynolds delivered the news. The badge that had given him so much power was placed on the desk between them. "Your actions have violated everything this badge represents," Captain Reynolds said firmly. "You are hereby terminated from your position, effective immediately." McLean's shoulders slumped as the weight of his actions finally caught up with him. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the office, past the colleagues who had once supported him, now watching in silent judgment as he left the building for the last time. The evening sun cast long shadows through the living room windows as Malik's family gathered in their home. His grandmother sat in her favorite armchair, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of pride. Aunts, uncles, and cousins filled the cozy space, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and joy. "When I heard what happened that night," his grandmother began, her voice soft but steady, "my heart nearly stopped. But watching you stand up for what's right, watching you carry yourself with such dignity—" She paused, reaching for Malik's hand. "Your mother would be so proud of the young man you've become." Malik squeezed her hand gently, feeling the warmth of her words wash over him. His Aunt Sarah wiped away tears as she added, "You didn't just speak up for yourself, baby. You spoke up for everyone who's ever been afraid to say something." "I was scared at first," Malik admitted, looking around at his family's loving faces. "But Mrs. Harris helped me see that sometimes being brave means doing what's right, even when you're afraid." His grandmother nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. "You've helped change things, Malik. Really change things. This town's going to be different now because you had the courage to stand up." Uncle Marcus, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. "Your actions didn't just get one bad officer off the force. You've made people talk about things they've been avoiding for years. That's real change, nephew." "The way the whole community came together," his grandmother continued, straightening in her chair. "That's something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. And it started with you, baby. You and that brave heart of yours." Malik felt his chest tighten with emotion as he looked at his family, his support system, his strength. Their pride in him filled the room like sunshine, warming him from the inside out. "We've always taught our children to do what's right," his grandmother said, her voice growing stronger. "But watching you actually do it, watching you stand tall in the face of everything, you've helped make a better future for this town, for all the young people coming up after you." The town hall's meeting room was packed to capacity on a bright Tuesday morning. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the faces of community members who had gathered for the police captain's announcement. Malik sat in the front row beside Mrs. Harris, who kept a protective hand on his shoulder. Police Captain Reynolds stood at the podium, his face stern but determined. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat to speak. "After a thorough investigation into Officer John McLean's conduct, and in light of substantial evidence of repeated misconduct, I am announcing his immediate termination from the police force," Captain Reynolds declared, his voice firm and clear. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of approval. Mrs. Harris squeezed Malik's shoulder gently, and he could see tears in her eyes. "Our department exists to protect and serve all members of this community," the captain continued. "When an officer betrays that trust, they betray everything we stand for. We must hold ourselves to the highest standards of conduct, and we must be accountable to the people we serve." Malik looked around the room at the familiar faces, neighbors, teachers, shop owners, who had stood by him throughout this ordeal. Some were nodding in agreement, others wiping away tears. "This decision," Captain Reynolds said, "reflects our commitment to building trust with our community. We acknowledge that there is more work to be done, but this is a significant step toward ensuring fair and equal treatment for all our citizens." Mrs. Harris stood up, her voice carrying across the room. "Thank you, Captain, for doing what's right. This shows our young people that their voices matter, that justice is possible when we stand together." The captain nodded respectfully in her direction. "Indeed, Mrs. Harris, and I want to specifically acknowledge young Mr. James. His courage in coming forward, his dignity in the face of adversity, and his commitment to justice have helped our department recognize where we need to improve." Malik felt his chest tighten with emotion as people turned to look at him with admiration and respect. The elderly couple who ran the bakery smiled warmly at him. His former middle school teacher dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Even some of the officers present nodded their approval. Moving forward, Captain Reynolds concluded, we will be implementing new training programs and oversight measures to ensure that what happened to Malik never happens to anyone else in our community. The room erupted in applause, the sound swelling to fill every corner. Mrs. Harris pulled Malik into a tight hug, whispering, "You did it, child. You really did it." Looking around at the united faces of his community, Malik felt a profound sense of validation. The road to this moment had been difficult, but seeing justice served made every challenge worthwhile. The townspeople's reactions confirmed what Mrs. Harris had told him from the start, that standing up for what's right could create real change. The community center buzzed with warmth and celebration on Saturday afternoon. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and tables laden with home-cooked dishes lined one side of the room. People from all corners of town had come together to honor Malik James and Mrs. Helen Harris. Malik stood near the entrance, overwhelmed by the steady stream of well-wishers. His grandmother beamed beside him, her eyes glistening with pride as neighbors approached to shake his hand or offer hugs. "You've shown us what real courage looks like," said Mr. Peterson, the retired schoolteacher. "Standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but you did it with such grace." Mrs. Harris worked her way through the crowd, greeting everyone with her characteristic warmth. When she reached Malik, she pulled him into a tight embrace. "Look around you, child," she whispered. "This is what community looks like. This is what change looks like." The mayor stepped up to the small podium at the front of the room, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. "Today, we celebrate two individuals who reminded us that justice requires both courage and persistence. Malik James and Mrs. Helen Harris showed us that one voice, backed by truth and supported by community, can move mountains." Malik felt his chest tighten with emotion as he looked around the room. There were faces he recognized from the town hall meetings, others from the church gatherings where people had shared their stories. Even some of the police officers who had supported the investigation had come to show their respect. A group of high school students approached Malik, led by his classmate Sarah. "You've inspired us," she said, her voice sincere. "We've started a student council committee focused on community relations because of what you did." The realization hit Malik then. His stand against injustice had created ripples far beyond that night on the lonely road. The town felt different now. People spoke more openly about fairness and accountability. They looked out for each other with renewed purpose. Mrs. Harris raised her glass of punch, drawing attention. "To Malik," she announced, her voice carrying across the room, "who showed us that age doesn't determine courage and that dignity can defeat discrimination." The crowd echoed her toast, and Malik felt tears welling up in his eyes. His grandmother squeezed his hand, and he could almost hear his mother's voice, telling him how proud she would be of the man he'd become. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the gathering. As Malik watched his neighbors sharing food and stories, laughing and talking together, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The fear and anger from that night with Officer McLean had transformed into something powerful and positive, a catalyst for change that had brought out the best in his community. A week after the community celebration, Malik stood before a crowd of young faces at the local youth center. The room was packed with teenagers from various schools across town, their eyes fixed on him as he adjusted the microphone. "When Officer McLean pulled me over that night," Malik began, his voice steady and clear, "I felt scared and alone. But what happened next taught me something important about standing up for what's right." The students leaned forward in their chairs, completely absorbed. A girl in the front row nodded vigorously as Malik described Mrs. Harris's intervention and the way the community had rallied around him. "The easiest thing would have been to stay quiet," he continued, scanning the attentive faces. "But my mom always taught me that doing what's right isn't always doing what's easy." Several students raised their hands, eager to ask questions. One boy, probably a freshman, spoke up. "Weren't you afraid of what might happen?" "I was," Malik admitted, remembering those tense days. "But being afraid doesn't mean you're not brave. It means you're doing something that matters." He shared how his grandmother's unwavering support and Mrs. Harris's fierce advocacy had shown him the power of community. As he spoke, he noticed students nudging each other, whispering and nodding in recognition of their own experiences. "You all have voices," Malik said, his words carrying to the back of the room. "And those voices matter. Whether it's standing up to bullying, speaking out against unfairness, or supporting someone who needs help, you can make a difference." A girl with bright eyes raised her hand. "How do you know when it's worth taking a stand?" Malik smiled, thinking carefully before answering. "When something feels wrong in your heart, when you know others might be hurt if nothing changes, that's when you need to speak up. And remember, you're not alone. There are always people who will stand with you, just like they stood with me." Looking out at the sea of young faces, Malik saw determination and hope reflected back at him. Some students were taking notes, others were recording his speech on their phones, but all of them were engaged, their expressions showing that his words were hitting home. The energy in the room was electric, filled with possibility. These young people weren't just listening, they were connecting with his story, seeing themselves in it, understanding that they too could be catalysts for positive change in their community. The following Saturday morning, Malik pulled up to Mrs. Harris's modest white house in his mother's old Honda Civic. The car had been his mother's pride and joy, kept spotless and running smooth despite its age. Now it was his, a precious reminder of her strength and dignity. Mrs. Harris was already on her front porch, sitting in her favorite rocking chair. Her face lit up when she saw Malik climbing the worn wooden steps, carrying a small bouquet of yellow daisies. "Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice full of emotion, "I had to come thank you properly. Without you stopping that night, without your voice speaking up for me, none of this would have happened." She accepted the flowers with a gentle smile, patting the empty chair beside her. "Sit down, child. You remind me so much of myself when I was young." As they settled into the peaceful morning, Mrs. Harris's eyes grew distant. "Back in '65, I faced my own Officer McLean, except back then there weren't many people willing to stand up and say something was wrong." Her voice carried years of pain but also wisdom. "That's why I couldn't drive past when I saw you walking that night. Some battles shouldn't have to be fought alone." Malik listened intently as Mrs. Harris shared stories from her youth, tales of resistance and resilience that had shaped her into the fierce advocate she'd become. Each word helped him understand the depth of her commitment to justice. "You know," she continued, adjusting her glasses, "seeing you stand up there at that town hall meeting, speaking your truth with such grace, it filled my heart with hope. Your mother would be so proud of the young man you've become." Tears welled up in Malik's eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. Harris. You showed me how to be brave, how to fight the right way." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You're more than just a neighbor or a family friend. You're my mentor." Mrs. Harris reached over and squeezed his hand, her own eyes glistening. "Sometimes God puts us in the right place at the right time, child. I may have helped guide you, but that courage, that was all yours." McLean sat in his empty apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with his belongings from the police station. His badge and uniform, once symbols of authority, now lay discarded on the coffee table. The silence was deafening, broken only by the steady tick of a wall clock. He picked up the morning's newspaper, its headline still stark and condemning. "Officer terminated following investigation into racial profiling." His hands trembled as he read through the article again, each word hitting him like a physical blow. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room. Images of that night with Malik James flooded his mind, the young man's respectful tone, his careful compliance, and McLean's own aggressive response. It hadn't been the first time he'd abused his power, but it would be the last. The faces of others he'd wronged over the years began to surface in his memory. Each stop, each confrontation, each moment he'd chosen intimidation over protection now weighed heavily on his conscience. The badge had given him authority, but he'd twisted it into something ugly. Across town, Malik walked through the neighborhood park, noticing how different people greeted each other now, with warmer smiles and genuine interest. The elderly couple who used to hurry past their neighbors now stopped to chat. The teenagers who once scattered at the sight of a police car now played basketball with the new community liaison officer. Mrs. Harris had been right. Standing up for justice had done more than address one incident. It had awakened something in their community, a sense of unity and shared purpose that transcended old barriers. Back in his apartment, McLean stood at his window watching families walk by below. They were no longer potential threats or suspects to him, just people, living their lives. The realization of how skewed his perspective had been hit him hard. His career was over, but more than that, his understanding of himself had crumbled. He thought about Malik's speech at the town hall, not with anger now, but with a growing sense of shame. The young man's dignity in the face of injustice highlighted everything McLean had lost sight of over the years. His power hadn't made him strong. It had made him weak, feeding his worst instincts until they consumed him. Now, stripped of his badge and uniform, McLean faced an uncertain future. But more challenging than the practical concerns was the weight of his past actions. The mirror reflected back a man he barely recognized, someone who had forgotten the true meaning of serving and protecting. If you enjoyed the story of Malik, Helen, and Officer McLean, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.